So tonight we're going to do something a little bit different, which is why I have stuff strode everywhere. It feels like I don't really like this feeling, but it is what it is. So we are doing a number of different things. First of all, we started a congregational study plan about 3 or 4 years ago. And this year, with our emphasis being on prayer, we've been putting out prayer cards. And, you know, that's a good idea if the guy who actually has them printed puts them out and doesn't let the days, get ahead. But they are available now. They're back here. They've been printed for months, sitting on a shelf in my office, and I forgot to put them out. And so when you exit out the sides, there are tables here, and you can see them. They're orange. Every 2 months is a different color. And so those are available for viewing, for you to take and for us to continue to go through. Now, in our study plan, what we're doing, as you remember, is we're going through books of the Bible. The goal is not necessarily to read through the Bible in a year. That's certainly an admirable goal, and there are people that are doing that, and that's good. But, we can read through the Bible in an entire year and still know nothing more about it. And so it may be better to simply go through, and what we've tried to design is where we're dealing with a chapter a day. We're pairing Old and New Testament books and going through that chapter a day, praying through one family in the directory with that particular chapter. And this year we tried, I don't know, we're printing about 50 or 60 of them, and Miss Tammy and I feel the fact that we're looming for the next book to come and print, and she's going to have to start lifting weights to make sure we can hit all those things and punch all these holes. But anyway, this is kind of the combined process for those who wanted them. The combined process of having the text there, the day there, the individual there, the two questions that we ask as we look at a text. And the questions we ask are what is the text saying? And then so what? Okay, what does this mean? What is the application? So, with that in mind, there have been a number of questions that people have asked and I've purposefully waited this many years before I actually put this book on the schedule, and that is what has been called the perennial killer of annual Bible reading plans, Leviticus. Okay, the perennial killer. A lot of people do good. They read through a year. The Genesis, Exodus, that tabernacle stuff seemed kind of repetitive. Leviticus, I'm out. That's kind of been the basic approach. But, so a lot of people have asked questions about how to handle it, what to look at. And so I think that's what I know that's what we're going to do tonight. I mean, that's what I prepared. But anyway, we're going to try and think through this a little bit, okay? Now, Leviticus is not a book that necessarily strikes most people. They're not drawn to it, okay? But this is something we have to keep in mind. Jesus quotes from Leviticus quite a bit. When he's asked what are the greatest commands in the law, he quotes from Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, and Leviticus 19:18. This important command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, it comes from Leviticus. And many times in his ministry, when he's healing, he will tell people, go to the priest. What's he talking about? What customs, what cleansing, what anything? Why is it considered to be scandalous or outside a social taboo that a woman with an issue of blood would come near him and touch him, or that a leper would approach him, or a ton of other issues? That makes no sense if you take Leviticus out. Okay? Now, I'm convinced Leviticus makes a lot more sense than just those things. But that kind of solidifies the place of Leviticus. As a matter of fact, Jewish children were very early on taught Leviticus because it was so incredibly important. So, I want us to think about it a little bit now. Not this week's bulletin, but maybe the week before or the week before that. I gave an overview of the book itself in a structured form. There is we have a study of it on our YouTube channel. It would have been, I wouldn't check any earlier. Check 2020, 2021. I don't think it would have been 22 or 23. But 2020 or 2021, where we give some attention to the book of Leviticus, giving an overview and kind of explaining it. And then, as always, there is the Bible Project. I would encourage you to pay close attention to what they say. It's a set of videos and illustrations that come along, and very well done, very well researched. It's not just, you kind of, internet sources are kind of like anything, right? Abe Lincoln warned us of that. So you have to watch your internet sources. But Bible Project, almost always going to be solid. So I would encourage you to look at those things. Now, with that in mind, here are a couple of things for us to remember as we're looking at Leviticus. So this is what I've got for us to do, is just keep some simple things in mind about how we look at it. And then I want to give you an outline of the book to kind of help you. Outlines, in my opinion, are very helpful because if you get into the details, you forget what this is even about. And an outline is a high view to remind you where you are on the landscape. Okay, so if you understand that, what I'm reading is somehow attached to this, which is attached to this. Okay? And then I want us to talk just for a minute about how the book opens with the first 7 chapters deal with the major offerings under the law of Moses. And kind of give you some insights on some of those things maybe. And then I will just I've got my study plan book up here and just walk through a couple of things and kind of explain how to look at some of those things. So, first of all, when it comes to this, odds are most people have never even read Leviticus, much less studied it. Okay? So one of the first things that we have to confront is our mindset and our attitude. Okay? If I'm going into Leviticus thinking that I'm going to understand, I'm just going to be able to read it and grasp it the same way I do books in the New Testament that I've studied my whole life, that's never going to happen. If we go in with that mentality, we are sunk before we start. You have to go into it realizing this is like learning anything that is new. Okay? Anyone who is now an expert on any subject, they all have one thing in common. At one point, they were a beginner. At one point, they knew nothing, and they learned it. So when we come to this book, we've got to understand that, I'm not going to get everything. I'm not going to be able to see everything. I'm not going to be able to pull everything out that some other people might who have spent years with it. Now, thankfully, some of those people have shared their studies and have helped us in that process, and we do have access to those. But the first thing is that attitude and disposition that says, accept it for what it is. It's different than me. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve my attention. Okay? And then going in and understanding that this is going to take a little more work and maybe a little more thinking. All right? The second thing for us to consider would be this. How are you reading it? How are you reading it? Why do we say that? Well, first of all, if I'm just taking a single swipe and I'm just saying, okay, I'm going to read this verse. Yep, don't understand that, or 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 that. That's not how you read. Okay? Yes, I am a nerd, and yes, I have this book, and I've read this book, and I recommend this book. But it needs to be taught. Like, it needs to be back in our educational system. Mortimer Adler's book on how to read a book. The ability to analyze and process information. Okay? And one of the first things that we do is we just simply read it. Okay? When we sit down with a particular chapter, whatever the chapter of assignment is, the first thing I need to do is just read the chapter in full. It's not the time to start breaking everything down and looking at every detail. Get the thought. Get the flow of thought in your head. All right? What is this about? Are there any patterns that are detected within the flow of the chapter? Okay? And that will come with many times of reading it. This time in Proverbs, I've kind of got a working theory on some of the things in Proverbs that I realized this time I've never seen before. And no, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be dumb and it be completely wrong. So I'm still looking at it. But you're looking at and you're trying to assess patterns. Okay? So I first read in the whole chapter. Then I need to pay attention to paragraphs. Okay? Paragraphs. So a lot of times our Bibles and our translators and our Bible publishers are giving us things we don't have any idea that they're there. And just understanding little things will help us. So when it comes to just simply purchasing Bibles, many people still, I prefer a paragraph form Bible. What I mean by that is you have two different approaches, a paragraph form and one which is kind of a block approach that every verse is its own line and its own structure. A paragraph approach is more mirroring the original that says we're going to combine all the verses together. So 34 is going to be rammed up against 33. It's going to be then 36 and 37 and 35. All this is going to be in there together as a full paragraph. They're not going to be individually broken down and indented. Okay? Now that takes a while to get used to with your eyes. But it's important because you can see very clearly the structure. Now, if you prefer not to have a paragraph Bible, usually your translators are going to give you an indication in your text of where the paragraph breaks are. So for an example, in some translations you will see what looks like a backward P. It's the paragraph symbol. Okay? Some translations. Matter of fact, I think when I use the King James, that symbol sticks out in my head. They would have it in those spots. It's not randomly there. They're telling you this is the beginning of the paragraph. People say, how do you know where it ends? Well, the next time you see the P, right before that, that's where it ends. Okay? Now, most translations will do something like this. They will place the verse number in bold. Okay? The verse number will be placed in bold. Now, sometimes the next paragraph will be the chapter number, and so you have to pay attention to the chapter number being in bold. But the bold font of the verse number, not the verse number, is their way of telling you this is the paragraph beginning. Okay? And so then, by doing that and understanding that there is structure to how this is being communicated, I'm then asking myself, and I'm looking at paragraphs, and I'm simply jotting an idea, jotting a thought of what is this paragraph saying out to the side. Okay, so when you have to, for an example, when you have to read a book and you have to write a critical review of a book, one of the things I do, I stick with whatever the author's headings are in that book, and I jot out beside every paragraph one summary word. So when I go back to write it, I can read that book in about 5 minutes, no matter how long it is. I can remind myself of everything that's in it in 5 minutes. Okay? So, the same thing is true with Bible study. What is this paragraph about? One word. What is this paragraph? Another word. And thus, when I come back to it, I can scan and move through information and process it very quickly. And so when we're reading it, reading the overall section, then I'm looking at the paragraph breakdowns and jotting down thoughts. And one of the things we see in these opening verses, these opening chapters where you have the sacrifices is what? If you pay attention to the paragraphs, what are you going to see? Well, if your offering is a lamb, this is what you do. Next paragraph, if your offering is a goat, this is what you do. If your offering is a pigeon or turtle doves, this is what you do. First of all, that's indicating a number of different things. Number one, it's indicating socioeconomic status. God is making provisions. He's not going to ask the poorest people of the land to offer the same amount as the people who are well off and comfortable. They cannot afford that. Now that also comes into play in the birth narratives with Jesus. Why is it then that we read of Joseph and Mary offering turtle doves or pigeons for the birth of Jesus? All of this, by the way, is Leviticus. Why is that going on? What is the significance? By the way, think about this. What are the consequences? Because the law reads that if a male child is not circumcised on the 8th day, he's cut off from the covenant. What if Jesus' parents hadn't observed that? Okay? So, taking that and understanding that, that's going to be Leviticus. People say it's repetitive. Yes, and for dummies like me, repetition is what works. Sometimes we're trying to overcomplicate things. When I see repetitive, when you see repetition, we've talked about this before, Hebrew culture is oral culture. Okay? It's oral. So, depending upon the culture and the circumstances and your abilities to communicate, they change the way how you communicate. Let me explain it this way. So, this morning, I didn't really go... You'll notice when we have a PowerPoint, I don't really spend a lot of time saying 1 and 2 and 3, major marching points, or reviewing those points, 1 and 2 and 3. Why? I don't have to. You can see them on the screen. But if we don't have the screen working, and I'm trying to get you to remember them rather than see them all the time in front of you, and I'm trying to get you to remember them, I'm going to repeat the process multiple times. Okay? So, the Hebrew culture is an oral culture. Even the New Testament's oral culture. The best estimates are about 1 in 10 people could read in the New Testament world. Okay? So it's oral. And that is, you're writing. Writing for the ear and writing for reading are two different worlds. So if I'm writing for the ear and I'm trying to drive home a point, I'm going to keep using the same word over and over again. Now, here's where modern American English hinders us. Modern American English hates the repetition of words throughout a document. You can, but it's considered very boring. Okay, so first do this, and then second, this is the point, and third, this is it, and fourth, this is it. Or you simply write this way. Well, to begin the discussion, 1, okay, further, 2, also, 3, still further, 4. We like to say the same thing with a bunch of synonyms. I promise you I'm going somewhere. Okay? We like to say all of these things with a bunch of synonyms. So when the Bible is communicating for an oral culture and they're pounding and they're hammering away at one word, they're saying, listen, this is the word. Don't overcomplicate it. This is the word. Okay? So when we're looking at these things, that's what's happening. All right, very quickly, let's look at an outline of the book. So, it breaks into 2 sections. This is my personal assessment. Some will see it a little bit differently. The first, and it all has to do with fellowship with God. So, the first 10 chapters, 1 through 10, deal with how to attain fellowship with God. How do you enter into fellowship with God? And then the second section, chapters 11 through 27, deal with how to maintain fellowship with God. Okay? So first, how do you attain fellowship with God? Well, the first 7 chapters dealt with the major sacrifices under the law. How are you going to attain fellowship with God? You have to have sacrifice. Because sin has to be punished. There's no way to attain it any other way. Then, in chapters 8 through 10, you see the ordination of the Aaronic priesthood. So you not only need a sacrifice, you need priesthood. By the way, this is the entire book of Hebrews. That's what this is. Hebrews 9 is a complete exegesis and discussion of Leviticus 16. And tons of other texts from here. So, and we could go through, and we talk about how to maintain fellowship. I'll just give them to you briefly for time's sake. In chapters 11 through 15, I call that classification. You're dealing with food laws. You'll see the phrases over and over again, not just with food laws, but with other issues that can come up with clean and unclean. Clean and unclean. Clean and unclean. Okay? That's his point of emphasis. Leviticus 16, it's its own special day. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the most important day on the Israelite calendar, the 10th day of the 7th month. Then chapter 17 to 22, it deals with conversation. That's an old word that deals with your conduct, your life. And so in these chapters you find a lot of ethical statements, how you should conduct yourself. Chapters 23 to 25 deal with consecration. It deals with the feasts of Israel. And then the book closes in 26 and 27, calling on them for consideration, because it deals with the promises that come with keeping the law and the curses that come with disobeying it. And we referenced them when we studied Kings. We were referencing there, and they're repeated again later in Deuteronomy for a new generation. So, seeing that may be helpful to us as we're looking at the book itself. Now, very quickly, let's look at these 5 offerings. The 5 offerings go this way: the burnt offering, the meal offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. Okay, so the burnt offering, when you open up chapter 1, the burnt offering is given where the whole offering is burned. Okay? The whole offering is burned, and that indicates total dedication to God. Okay? So the burnt offering is voluntary. That is, the person brings it of their own free will and volition. And it indicates dedication to God. That's why the whole thing is burned. That's not true of every sacrifice. But the whole thing is burned, the idea of complete sacrifice, complete offering. Okay? Now people say, what does that got to do with anything? Well, what does Romans 12, 1 and 2 say? I beseech you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice. This voluntary, complete dedication offering. He's playing on these images. All right, the meal offering indicated gratitude toward God. The peace offering indicated communion with God. It means that God, the person offering it and God are at peace with one another. So think about Romans 5 and verse 1. We now have been justified by faith, and we have peace with God through Christ Jesus our Lord. Same idea. Then you got the sin offering, which dealt with the atonement for sin, which you can think ultimately about Jesus through that particular lens. And then the trespass offering, which dealt with certain sins, but especially sins of ignorance. You know, there's this long discussion that spans over in a couple of chapters throughout this process in the opening parts of the book that deal with if you commit a sin and you're ignorant of it, but then you come to knowledge that what you did was wrong. You didn't realize it, but that's what do you do? So we have those particular offerings. All right. So just a couple of things as we close. I want to flip through and see some things here. So just looking at Leviticus 1. If you look at Leviticus 1, again, we're getting a breakdown based upon the animals that are being offered, which again illustrates socioeconomic status. So in verse 3, you see that if the herd is offered, if an animal from the herd is offered, it's male without blemish. Lay the hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it'll be accepted to make an atonement for him. Lay the hand on the head is the idea of transference. And then it says it's a pleasing aroma to God. That is a sweet smell. the appeasement of his wrath. And by the way, Ephesians 5:1-2 speaks of Jesus with the same terminology. In verse 10, you see the flock. From the sheep or the goats, be a male without blemish. It will also be a pleasing aroma. In verse 14, if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, this is what he should do, and it will be a pleasing aroma to God. Leviticus 2, there's a difference between where the offering is baked. If his offering is a fine flour, or if it's baked in the oven, or baked on a griddle, or cooked on a pan. Leviticus 3, you've got the same issues. Leviticus 4, we're dealing with a lot of unintentional sins. A lot of unintentional sins. All right? A lot of other things we could say. I want us to close with this because we're asking questions like what and so what. All right, so think about Leviticus 4 with those questions, dealing with unintentional sins. It's broken into multiple categories. Chapter 4, verse 1, verse 2, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally. All right? Verse 3, if it is an anointed priest who sins, this is what you do. Verse 13, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, this is what you do. Verse 22, when a leader sins, doing unintentionally any one of all the things of the commandments of the Lord. Verse 27, if any one of the common people sins unintentionally, this is what you are to do. Okay, so what is this text saying? Okay, you have to get out of trying to understand the inner workings. There's a time and place to look at that. But at this point, we're just simply not at that place. Okay? So we're asking ourselves, take a high-level view, if we're dealing with unintentional sins, what is this saying? Well, there are a number of things that you could walk away from this and see about God. The first of which is, apparently there is no one who is exempt from sins of ignorance. Why does he list out the categories that cover everybody? If it's a priest, if it's the whole congregation, if it's a leader, if it's a common man. Then after that, it must be that God has already thought through every scenario and has created a way for every single person to be granted forgiveness if they seek it. That's telling me something about God. Furthermore, you're dealing with the issue of sins of ignorance, unintentional. Unintentional. And in this particular context, it says, and if he comes to realize it, or if someone points it out to him, well, then he becomes very responsible for making atonement. But God understands that we will do things, and many times do things that are wrong, and they're unintentional. Okay? There's not really much worse of a feeling in the world than to realize something that you have done, the Bible very plainly said it was wrong, and somehow you just missed it. Like, that's a sick feeling. But God understands and has provision. And we need to understand that about ourselves, okay? So what? What I wrote in the margin on that particular day was, never take sins of ignorance lightly. Never take ignorance lightly. Just because God has made provisions for my ignorance is not a license for me to remain ignorant. That's what I'm learning. It says either he comes to learn it or somebody points it out to him. I've got to be a person who is open to learning. I've got to be a person who is willing to consider the possibility that I have done something that is wrong. Which for some people, which absolutely blows my mind, they don't do anything wrong. That's amazing to me. But I have to have a disposition that says, I could very well be wrong. That's really the posture of all learning. is an acknowledgement of ignorance. And so the book itself which we're kind of in the portion now where it's going to transition to some things where some of the application, some of the understanding of the text will get a little bit easier, or may not feel as monotonous with ritual anyway. But hopefully some of these things can help us as we're walking through it, because I don't want anybody. I know the feeling of being discouraged. I know the feeling of being frustrated when we're studying Scripture. And, you hit a wall, and, a lot of people say the Bible is written on a fifth grade level. I would encourage you to look into that a little more closely. I don't think that's accurate. Okay? I'll just leave it there. It's complicated. Okay? And so it does not make you dumb or insufficient because you may look at something in the Bible and not understand what it means. I have read and studied some of the smartest people in this world when it comes to Scripture. And every one of them have texts. You look at them and say, hey, what do you think about this? And they're like, oof, I don't know. Okay? But the goal is to stay with it, get what you can on this trip, and we'll be back again at some other point. And you'll be surprised at what happens, because as you grow to understand one book, it illuminates your understanding of another book that illuminates your understanding of another book, and when you circle back around, you read this thing again, and it looks completely different. It's a process. It's not a thing where you get a certificate that says, hey, although if you want a certificate that says I read Leviticus, I studied through Leviticus, we could probably print some. But it is worthwhile. It is worthwhile. So, but as we think about Leviticus and fellowship with God, it is a book that is very important, even in our generation, even though we may not be under the law. It is a book that teaches us something about redemption. It teaches us what God has done in Christ to save us. The New Testament images of sacrifice and Jesus being our sacrifice, they're all saturated in this. And so to the degree that we understand this is to the degree that we even appreciate our own salvation and who Jesus is and how all these images can be rolled into one being. Becomes pretty phenomenal. And so if we want fellowship with God, the message of Leviticus is you need two things. You need sacrifice and you need priesthood. The message of the New Testament is Jesus is the sacrifice and Jesus is the priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he serves as your priesthood, and his priesthood is a continuing, everlasting priesthood. He cannot die, in contrast to Levitical priesthood. And so if a person will accept the sacrifice of Jesus, then they will have the availability of his priesthood to constantly represent them before God, which is, again, the totality of Hebrews. And so receiving him, having our bodies washed in pure water and our consciences sprinkled clean. That's a picture of what happens at baptism. Our bodies are washed, the symbolic washing, and our souls being sprinkled with blood is a way of entering into covenant. Exodus 24. And so if a person will do that, they enter into fellowship with God, or if maybe we're struggling with sin, maybe we're struggling with other things, we have a priest who understands what it's like to be us and can represent us. That's Hebrews 4. If we can help you with that tonight, we want to, as we stand and sing this song.